Good evening everyone, Fáilte Roimh. I'm delighted to welcome you to this event, which I'm sure will be a fascinating discussion of the experience of gay Irish migrants and LGBT politics in London in the 1980s. Dr Daryl Leeworthy and Dr Joseph Healy will discuss the paper published by Daryl on this subject and those issues which it addresses. This will be followed by an audience Q&A moderated by my colleague Vanessa Monaghan, the chair of the London Irish LGBT Network. Daryl's paper, which was linked to the Eventbrite invitation which you received, explores the role of Irish activists in the LGBT civil rights movement in 1980s London. Those of you who have read it ahead of this evening's event will know that there were a number of key Irish activists in this movement and the strong role played by migrants in gay society and grassroots politics more generally. I look forward to learning more about these activists, who include the likes of Mark Ashton, a very familiar name following the 2014 film Pride, which focused on the group he spearheaded, Lesbians and Gays Support the Minors. For many people, including some of you joining us tonight, Ireland for many decades was not a very welcoming place if you were a member of the LGBTQ+ community. As a student in the early 80s in Dublin, I know that London was seen as somewhere one could live more freely as part of a larger, more diverse and more visible community, although discrimination was still experienced here. The Irish government's new diaspora strategy recognises the need to heal and renew the relationship with emigrants who left Ireland in such alienating circumstances, and this will be a priority area of work for my team at the Embassy in the years ahead. The role played by the Irish and many other migrants in campaigning, often under hostile circumstances, for LGBTQ+ civil rights was vital in bringing about positive social change in Britain and later in Ireland. This progress has enriched our societies and made the world a much better place for many people today. However, while progress has been made, it is important that we continue to learn from history. LGBTQ+ civil rights sadly remain an aspiration in too many parts of the world. Furthermore, here in Britain, as was apparent in a recent case involving the company's Pontins, we see that discrimination is still experienced by our fellow citizens. Any discrimination targeted on any group undermines equality for us all, something we must continue to remind ourselves of and be vigilant about. Today, the 8th of March, is International Women's Day. It is a day on which we especially recognise the contribution of women to our society. So I look forward to hearing this evening about the contribution of women to LGBTQ+ activism here in London. I will now hand over to Vanessa Monaghan, who will moderate this evening's proceedings. Before doing so, I would again like to thank Dr Daryl Leeworthy and Dr Joseph Healy in advance for their contributions, and the committee of the London Irish LGBT Network, who helped put together this event in conjunction with my colleagues Isabel O'Connor and Rachel Ingersoll. Gur míle maithagah go léir, agus inis Vanessa.
Hi folks, thanks very much Ambassador. Everybody, welcome to the event. Firstly, we have to thank the Ambassador and to all the Embassy team, especially Rachel and Izzy, for their help and cooperation in putting together tonight's event. And also I want to thank Dr Pat McDonough for his introduction to Daryl as well. We'd be nowhere without Pat in all this tonight. Right, a little bit about the London Irish LGBT Network. I was elected chair last year. We are a small community organisation here in London. And since coronavirus changed the world this time last year, we looked at ways in how we can ensure that our community was still being catered for, and to ensure some way that we could provide a safe space for people. So we started online virtual meetups towards the end of last year. Probably I think it was September or October we started these. And it was really a way of engaging with our members that we weren't physically able to meet, and also to provide a safe space for people who wanted to come spend an hour with some friends, even if they didn't know us. It's a friendly, safe environment. Everyone's welcome. You know, there's no discrimination. You can be who you are within that space. And that was really important, because during lockdown, during the past year, a lot of people have ended up in situations and in places that they would not necessarily choose to be in. So our little group doing what we were doing, we wanted to make sure that we could provide a safe space for those people. Now, every month we either talk to a member of the LGBTQ community about their lives and their work, whether it be art, film, whatever it is, music, or we talk about a particular topic. Now, since 2021, since January actually, we have been looking at the topics of housing for older LGBT people. And also then a couple of weeks ago, we actually had a really successful night celebrating our trans community. And there's a lot of work going in around that, and hopefully we'll have a follow-up to that event later on in the year. On the 17th of May is probably going to be the next big notable event. It's the International Day against homophobia, transphobia, and biphobia. So we're going to have an event that night. We're going to look at how we can help the victims of hate crime, safe ways of reporting hate crime, as well as looking forward to how we can educate those around us. Now, if you want to find out more about our little group, we would love you to get involved. Go over to our website, sign up and subscribe to our mailing list, and we can let you know what's going to be happening over the next couple of months. We have some other events in the pipeline. So we hope that you would, like this evening, we hope that you would be interested and that you'd like to get involved maybe as well. So our little website is londonirishLGBT@wordpress.com. I'll put it in the comments as well, so you can go over there later. But enough about that, on to tonight. So we'll have a Q&A at the end. So if you would like to ask any questions, just pop them into the Q&A box and we can go through them, and I'll direct them to Daryl and to Joseph. But it is International Women's Day as well. So on the back of that, the success of the TV show, I Guess It's a Sin, has sparked a rejuvenated interest in this era that we're talking about tonight. And from a historical point of view, it's important that we talk about it, because it's a really important time for Irish LGBTQ history, and one that people don't know a whole lot about, especially when people left Ireland and came to London for treatment. So it's something that, people don't know about or don't talk about. So we're very, very happy, and we're delighted that the embassy has given us this platform to do that tonight. It's really important to do it. But one of the talking points around or from the show was the Jill character. She was a woman. She was a friend of the gay household, and she was an activist. And I think now is a really good time as well, and it being International Women's Day, that we also salute all those women who cared for the sick and dying Irish gay migrants who came to London at the time because there was no treatment in Ireland. So we have to salute them today on International Women's Day and thank them for all their hard work. And they're just a credit. We will be forever indebted to those women. Right, so on to our guests and introducing our guests. Dr. Daryl Leeworthy is a Rhys Davies Research Fellow at Swansea University. He has written widely on British and Irish LGBT history, including the Oxford Dictionary of National Biography entry for Mark Ashton and A Little Gay History of Wales, which was published in 2019. And he's currently writing a history of the Irish LGBTQ diaspora, which I want a proof of. Before it goes to the printers, I want to read it. Also tonight with us, we have our own Dr. Joseph Healy. Joseph is a historian with a PhD in Eastern European history and was very active in the early LGBTQ rights campaigns in Dublin and in Northern Ireland. Joseph also lived here in London in the 1980s. From the early 90s, Joseph was actively involved in the HIV support groups and organisations, and today is the regional LGBT committee. He is on the regional London LGBT committee of Unite, and recently was elected to the national committee. And he has spoken also about the Irish gay immigrants' experience in London in the 80s and his role in that. So I'm going to be quiet. Gentlemen, the floor is yours.
Thank you, Vanessa. Well, Daryl and I were talking the other day, and he pointed out that he was born in 1986, so he's just a slip of a lad, really. But in the 80s, I was in my prime, so to speak, and I had arrived in. I'd been active, as Vanessa said, in Dublin in various aspects of the LGBT movement, but that's another story. And as the ambassador alluded to, I emigrated along with many, many other young Irish people to London. In fact, a friend of mine who worked in the job centre at the time said to me recently, I thought that London was full of Irish. So many young Irish people were coming to the job centre looking for work. So I found myself in London in 1984, and it was it was a very different place to the London of today. And I think there's an interesting quote from Anne Rossiter, who's one of the women who was involved with the London Irish Women's Centre, where she said the discourse was of the Irish as turbulent, if not terrorist. And that was very much the scenario into which we as migrants came. It was a very hostile atmosphere in the period of Thatcherism and so on. So Daryl, it's interesting, you've written this gay history of Wales and so on, and a number of other books. And what's drawn you to Irish LGBTQ history?
Well, I blame it on Pat McDonough if I could get away with it, but he wouldn't let me get away with it. Actually, what happened was I was up in Manchester looking at the Lesbians and Gay Support the Miners paperwork, looking at what was going on down here in South Wales during 1984 and 1985. And then I came across this flyer which said the Irish members of LGSM invite you to a St. Patrick's Day event at Mark Ashton's flat in March 1985. And I thought, hang on a minute, there's a whole story here that wasn't in the film and that none of the other historians who talked about LGSM have mentioned. And so I've been ticking away at that very question, is that who were the other members who were Irish? And it turns out actually there are quite a number of them, both who have a certain degree of fame from the film because they happen to be there or because of other things. And I was curious to see where they'd come from, what their experiences of growing up in Ireland, on all parts of the island actually, had been, and how they got to London to become part of LGSM, to answer Vanessa's question there, which was Lesbians and Gay Support the Miners, for those of you who missed the acronym at the beginning. And so here's a group of Londoners, they're described in the film, who are actually much more mixed than that, coming down to South Wales to support folks down here, and what that cross relationship was. And it just turned out that there were a lot of Irish folks in that, and that's where I started and where I continue, really.
And prior to that, did you have much contact with Ireland, or did you know much about the history of LGBTQ movement there?
Not as much. The first thing I ever wrote about Ireland was, of course, about the GAA, which is a whole different battle of a fish that we can get into at another time. And it was really that. It was I happened across a friend of mine who I think is in the audience, David Toms, who's a historian of Irish sport, a poet, and so forth. And we met each other at a pub, but he said, "Oh, you should come over to Cork one day," and so I did. That kind of flowed there. But it was sports history, it was politics, it was that high level sort of labour history, which you can see in some of the other books and things that I've done. But it had very little to do with Irish LGBT history and until that flyer. And so I saw that flyer and suddenly a whole world was opened up by something else. Yeah.
Well, you sparked my interest, when I saw your paper, because as I said, I'm what you call in the trade, a primary source, because of course I was living here and experiencing all of that at the time, and I've referred a moment ago to this, the atmosphere of Thatcherism and anti-Irishness and so on. But your paper made me think about the extent to which quite a high percentage of Irish people were involved in both the radical LGBTQ movement and the wider radical movement. And in some ways, there's an echo in that of the Chartists, that Fergus O'Connor and people like that. There was always a very high percentage of Irish activists in a lot of those radical movements, wasn't there?
There was, yeah. And there's an interesting character in the GLC, the Greater London Council at the time. The deputy leader up to 1984 was a gentleman called Illtyd Harrington. And Harrington, of course, some of you will recognize the surname there. His family were all Irish immigrants in the 19th century, and they'd sort of grown through. And his dad, Tim Harrington, had gone to fight in Spain on the Republican side from the Southwest Coalfield. So there's an interesting echoes all the way through, even right to the top of the GLC, which is an interesting thing to pick out, which I didn't get to in the paper, but is certainly going to feature in the wider research and wider stories that we can tell.
Well, if we sort of paint a picture of London at that time, as you said, it was, you know, that the heyday of privatization, loads of money and all that sort of thing. But the antithesis of that, of course, was Ken Livingstone and his Greater London Council. And they were seen very much as defenders of the LGBT community at a time when there was horrendous homophobia. Now, I remember going to, I think it was the South Bank, to the Royal Festival Hall, where the GLC actually funded 2 alternative productions of Gilbert and Sullivan operas, where they actually put Thatcher and various figures like that as the villains in the piece. And, you know, it was really popular, very, very funny. So the GLC and Ken Livingstone were, you know, cocking a snoot at Thatcher. And of course, especially in relation to her policies on Ireland as well. But in your paper, you draw out 4 people in particular. So do you want to say something about them?
Yeah, this was the easiest way of telling that story because there are so many people. So we start off really with Colin Clifford in the 70s and Paul Hegarty. Paul Hegarty we'll come to in a second. But Colin Clifford is really interesting because he comes across in the 70s, he gets involved in the Brixton squats and that whole famous element of London LGBT history. He starts to get involved heavily in gay theatre, which is, and he uses those platforms to really explore the relationship which is running through all of this talk tonight, and most of the folks in the audience's lives as well, I'm sure, about your Irishness and your queerness, if you like, those two things that work together, sometimes clash, sometimes don't fit within the official stories one way or the other, and also find great clashes when you land in an established LGBT movement in a different country. And then we're like, oh, we don't really worry about things like national identity, but actually those are fundamentals. And so Colin Clifford really explored those in his theatre and his short stories, which won prizes back home in Ireland as well in the 80s. And his attempts at drawing out memoir in Out magazine, for instance, those are published there. And then Port Hegarty. Port Hegarty comes across around in a similar time in the 70s. He's also involved in similar kinds of movements like that. But perhaps the most important thing about him is that he ends up as the manager of Gaze the Word bookshop. And this is another remarkable part of the story. Here's this iconic bookshop in the heart of London, managed for almost the entire length of its existence by Port on the one hand, and then the third of the four characters, Jimmy McSweeney, who many of us will know from popping into the bookshop now and again when we ever happen to be in London or are resident in London. So Jimmy adds that extra Irishness to that whole story of Gaze the Word, which is really remarkable. And I'm not sure that's really appreciated outside in the wider world, that there is the bookshop for Britain's LGBT movement, and it is run by 2 Irishmen pretty much for the whole of its existence, and has Irish folks behind the scenes as well, like Glenn McKee. And finally then, the fourth character is Mark Ashton, who has become an icon all of his own as a latter-day icon. Oh, if Jim's in the audience, hello Jim. And Mark Ashton is a latter-day icon. He comes across in the 80s and throws himself really into all sorts of different things. And I know there are folks in the audience who can tell us all sorts of stories about Mark Ashton, but he ends up as the key figure in Lesbians and Gays Support the Miners, and obviously has had that kind of posthumous fame. There's the blue plaque at Gaze the Word now to him, and so on and so forth. So it's those four characters are really central, but their lives are images of everything else, the complexities that are involved in migration at particular times, which parts of the island they're from. That makes a big difference. Mark and Pord and so on are from the north, and that does make a big difference coming across in the 70s and the 80s. And the fact that 3 of the 4 of them pass, and this is what Vanessa was hinting at earlier, from an AIDS-related illness, and that is again that part of the story, isn't it? That's the end point of what we're getting at, that they are activists, but nevertheless their activism tells us all about the rest of what was going on in London amongst the Irish community in London in the 80s.
Yeah, that's quite interesting. I mean, I think Jim is in the audience there, and he's made some comment about the theatre group. But I mean, of the people you named, I mean, Mark Ashton's probably the most famous, with both the film Pride, as you've said, has sort of brought him back into common, memory, and also the Communard song, of course, For a Friend, which was written in 1988, I think the year after he died. And there's even talk now of having a monument built to him, isn't there, in Antrim, in the town where he grew up. And of those, I mean, I met Pord Hegarty a couple of times, and I didn't know Colm, but I actually shared a flat in Dublin with Colm's sister. And at that point, Colm was living in Barcelona and sending very lurid accounts of his wild life in Barcelona to his sister, whose sister was in a lesbian relationship in Dublin, and they were having, great time reading the letters and giving me accounts of it. So he sounded like a very colorful character indeed, especially if you were living in Dublin in the early 80s. But his work as well, his plays. Our group recently, about 2 years ago, we organized a staged reading of one of his plays, Rio Rita, and I actually played one of the characters. And another one of his plays, I've read the script. It's Reasons for Leaving, I think, or Reasons for Staying, isn't it? Can't remember now. And there's another one I've been told about recently, which I haven't read, called Wild Canolian Boy, which apparently was received very well when it was performed in Dublin. And as you say, I think he was on the verge of having a major breakthrough as a writer, because I think he won the Hennessy Award, didn't he, for upcoming playwrights. But in relation to Colm's plays, I mean, certainly in Rio Rita and also in Reasons for Staying, there is this development throughout the play, this schizophrenia almost, of wanting to return to Ireland, but not wanting to accept everything that came with that, the repression, the Catholicism, the homophobia and so on, but also being aware of being Irish in an England which was intensely anti-Irish at the time. And we mustn't forget that at the time the IRA bombing campaign was still in operation, and the level of hostility against the Irish was intense. So Colm's plays, at least the 2 I've seen, both deal with that issue, which I think is interesting.
Yeah, they do. And I think that's one of the complexities, isn't it? That Rio Rita is particularly interesting because that's the clash, the 2 characters, one of which is a young radical who wants to be part and parcel of the Troops Out movement and so forth. And the other one's a bit like, well, to be honest, what are we worrying about that for? We've got bigger things to worry about just by making our lives here in London. And are we really going back? Can't we just sort of get on with it? And there's a really nice transition at the end where a new migrant arrives and that whole story begins again, which I think sums it up quite well, actually. And something I discovered recently is that when that play was first performed, and I'm not sure which role you took on, Joe, but it possibly was the one that Jimmy inaugurated at the beginning, is that the person who interviewed Colm and Jimmy for Out magazine was none other than Pord Hegarty. So it's a really nice triangle between the 3 of them talking about the issues that are involved in the play, the experiences, the differences perhaps that come from the different pathways of migrating from the island to Britain and to London in particular, and the subtly different generational vantage points that you've got. And I think that helps a lot as well. You see this on the women's side of things, particularly in the conferences that were held in the London Irish Women's Centre in Stoke Newington in the 80s, as you see those very issues debated, with the one twist, which is they always say, you know, we're the true invisible ones. There are, no one really thinks that Irish lesbians exist. And there's this wonderful quote from Ray Dowds in 1987, I think, and I'm fairly sure it made it into the film that they made about the London Irish Women's Centre a few years ago, which is, she says, "I'm here to tell you that unlike leprechauns, Irish lesbians exist, and I am an Irish lesbian." Which is a wonderful quote because it sums up this notion that there's the invisibility. And that's the great issue that we're tackling all the way through this portrait of activism in the 80s, is that we just are given this story of LGBT activism in Britain and never given any sense of the variety or nuances that are involved in that. And if you read all of the textbooks which have emerged on the LGBT movement in Britain, there's no notion that any of the leading figures in a lot of these movements actually were themselves migrants. And I think that's really quite an important part of the story to restore, and to remind ourselves of why it would be that migrants would be particularly interested in civil rights and representation of identity. And I think that is something that the GLC got right because its ethnic minorities unit recognised the Irish for the first time as an ethnic minority, and were therefore able to give a lot of material and financial support to these movements. And that was really in advance a lot of the other states, and state support coming from either government on either island. That was well in advance of that. I think that really made a big difference, and I think that's why London was so far ahead of some of the other cities that Irish migrants settled in, Bristol, London, Bristol, Leeds, Glasgow, or whatever. They didn't have that same material and financial support to help out.
Yeah, well, I remember going to, in those days, we had some gay bars in London which were marked as alternative, and they tended to be sort of, the only places where you got vegetarian food and left-wing customers and so on. And one of them was the Fallen Angel in Islington, and that was a hangout for people like Lesbian, the Gay, Support the Minors. And I remember going there and having the collection tins and things like that. But as I said to someone recently at a LGBT History Month event, we always get the impression now after the film Pride and all the rest that the LGBT population in London was all left wing and supporting the minors. I mean, it was far from being the truth. There were a lot of Tory gays, and in fact, I think I read recently that in 1990 Thatcher was voted Person of the Year by one of the major gay magazines at the time. So yeah, I think history has a habit sometimes of creating a scenario, especially with a film or a drama series, which isn't totally accurate, I think.
Yeah, oh no, absolutely. And I think that's the danger, isn't it? We were talking about this the other day when we were planning about the experience between real life and history. And the two things don't always come together. And I think that's the value of a lot of the oral histories that have been undertaken on all over the place, really, is of trying to fit together what is left in terms of the paperwork and what is there in terms of having lived through it and having experienced it, and filling in the gaps that are never written down. And I think that's something that you're very conscious of when you start writing more contemporary history, that you are touching on people's lives that are still very much present, and they can very much remember what it was like. And it's very difficult sometimes to convey in writing exactly what that atmosphere was like, exactly what it would be like in 1990 when Capital Gay says, "Hey, Thatcher's the most brilliant LGBT icon on the planet. You think, well, 2 years ago she said that she was the worst person on the planet, and 2 years after that they said much the same thing. So it's you know, these snapshots in time which produce a narrative that is flatter than anything that could ever be lived.
Yeah, so we mentioned the issue of AIDS earlier, and of course, I mean, maybe you want to go into this a bit more, is the fact that, you know, AIDS was the cause of death of at least 3 of these people. I think Jimmy's the only one who's left living now. And of course, you know, it swept London at the time, and we've seen from It's a Sin those images of fear, and you know, I myself remember, I think it's Richie, the character in It's a Sin, is afraid to go for the HIV test, and I remember at the time feeling very similar myself, because of course the only outcome of that was that you had a death sentence, and then it was just a question of, you know, how long you had, and there was a real, you know, sense of dread, I think, all the time in the background. But perhaps you might like to say about the impact of that on the people you mentioned.
Yeah, I think that's certainly part and parcel of Port dies much later. He's into the late 90s, whereas Mark and Colin pass away quite close together, actually, in the late 80s, and are not amongst the earliest, but they are nevertheless part of what becomes a statistic which is still quite shocking, which is that more people of Irish descent died of an AIDS-related illness in London than were dying or died in Ireland in itself. And it was a significant figure in Dublin and Cork and other cities and towns anyway. But for that to be even bigger. So this is a story which is embedded within the emigrant experience of that time. And not just if you were a permanent resident. As Vanessa mentioned in her introduction about people moving across to make use of the services. There are even adverts, if you look in GCN and in Ouch magazine, which is possibly just a bit too early for it, you see adverts for the hospices in North Wales because they're the closest to Dublin. So there you are, this most controversial hospice in North Wales, which the locals don't want. It's being advertised in Dublin as essential to the Irish community. Go, that's the nearest place if you need it. That's where to go. So to put that all together, I think, is really powerful. And yet the emigrant story is absent, and a lot of that experience, that a lot of the storytelling, a lot of the history books and a lot of the articles are very much about what goes on in this country, what goes on in that country, but we're forgetting the fact that that border was extraordinarily porous. And for LGBTQ communities particularly, that border is almost non-existent. You're crossing it because there is a service that you need. I think what that does is forces all sorts of governments at local and national level to think about how to deal with that. And that's where the more official organizations start coming through in the 90s. So Positively Irish Action, founded in 1989 by someone, at least one of the co-founders was a relative of Michael Collins somehow, but then I think half of Cork is a relative of Michael Collins somewhere. And he and a Roman Catholic priest who can't deal with the notion of celibacy whilst he's still living with his partner, they helped set up, in conjunction with a lot of other folks, Positively Irish Action. That's then given money by the Irish government in 1990, which helps them appoint a caseworker. And that really starts developing the official support. And that's visited in, I think, 1992 by Mary Robinson during her presidency. So again, really does give this official status to what had been in the 80s an activist movement. Yet it doesn't last very long. This is the money runs out, and then the official support runs out, and the activists are left to themselves again. And all that money has gone by 96. So Positive Irish Action disappears by the mid-90s because the money is taken away, or isn't replaced, or isn't renewed, or whatever it is. And the resources in the community just aren't there. And I think that's I think that's something that we can pick on and pick out if we want to, Joe, is start to think about that tension between the official and the activist, and the way in which those two play against each other, particularly in the 90s, because of course, as in the 80s, as you can tell us anyway, it was just assumed that the state didn't care much, and so therefore we're not bothering with them anyway. But in the 90s, there's that little dusting of gold dust at times, isn't there? And it quickly dissipates.
Yeah, well, actually, I was a client of Positively Irish Action on AIDS, and they did a wonderful job. I was involved with them in probably the last 3 years of their existence, and in Luke Tierney was one of the great caseworkers there. And he was a friend of mine. Unfortunately, he died there about 4 years ago, tragically. He had a history of he'd been a drug user, and then of course, because a lot of the clients coming to Positively Irish were not just gay men, but a lot of drug users as well. He played a very important role there. But in the campaign they had in 1996, when their funding was being withdrawn, I mean, we were all signing petitions and all the rest to try and save it, because at the time the combination therapy had just appeared, the new treatment, and I think the health authorities felt, well, now we can sort of de-escalate all of this. But Siobhan Reardon, who was the director, said in 1996 we've already seen 300 people in the first 6 months of 1996. That was 1996. And I remember Dr. David Shaw, who's in the Institute of Irish Studies in Liverpool University. He spoke at a conference we organized a couple of years ago. And he said, as you were saying, that in the 80s, about half of the hospital beds in most AIDS wards in London were occupied by Irish patients. And I know a documentary filmmaker I met in Dublin a few years ago who said this is a really untold story, really something that there needs to be a documentary about. And I would hope that RT or someone else would pick up the baton, because I think it is a huge story, really.
Yeah, oh no, definitely. It wouldn't be an easy story, but it would be a necessary story. I think this is it's something that it struck me, and it's the sin. Knowing this background as well. How come all the I know there's a Welsh character, and I wouldn't change episode 3 for anything, even though it turns us all into soppy messes at the end of it. But there was a curious lack of Irish characters in the series, given the predominance of Irish members of the LGBTQ community at that time. And that struck me about that particular series. So I think, you could almost have like Sure It's a Sin or something like that as an alternative to tell the Irish story. But the immigrant story has to be at the heart of that, because the services were much stronger in London than they were back home, either in the North or in the Republic. So you couldn't get away from that. And I think on this side, we're particularly bad at acknowledging the fact that there was this multiplicity as well. I think that's one of the criticisms I would level at It's a Sin, is that it is a bit British when it shouldn't have been, really.
Well, we were talking about International Women's Day earlier, and I saw an account recently by someone who was a nurse in an AIDS ward in London, and he said there were 2 groups of staff. One were the Irish staff, who at this stage were intensely anti-religious. I wonder why. And they were often the most, empathetic with the HIV patients, the nurses, the Irish nurses and so on, who'd come over. Whereas, some of the other staff were very religious and very homophobic and whatever. So I think that's interesting.
It is, yeah. And that's something that is perhaps sometimes difficult to grapple with, isn't it? Is if there's a quote that I read, I think it's in Tim Pat Coogan's book on Wherever the Green is Worn, where he interviews one of the co-founders of Positively Irish Action on AIDS. And the thing that he says is, you've got all of the burdens that come with being LGBTQ anyway, but then there's sin on top of that, and you're stuck with this notion of sin, which is very difficult to navigate and to deal with. But actually what that tells me is it's both sin, but also this official notions of Irishness, which are very, very difficult to navigate. And I think that's what, reading some of the testimony from those who were involved in the lesbian workshops at the London Irish Women's Centre, is that they constantly say this point, which is that we get almost as much homophobia from the Irish immigrant community who aren't LGBTQ+, as we do back home. And we didn't think it was going to be like that. The whole reason we were moving here is to get away from that. And we've landed right in the middle of it here. And in some respects, it's 10 times worse because you've got that romantic version of home that second generation folks bring with them as a way of trying to be more Irish than their parents because their parents had left. And so, you know, that's something which is a very difficult feature to pull out and to start pulling on these threads which are embedded in the Irish immigrant experience, but are not necessarily always present when we start to think about queer identities. We just leave a lot of that to one side sometimes, but perhaps we have to restore it.
I think we have to go over to Vanessa now. Vanessa, I think you're going to pick us up in the Q&A.
Yeah, there's well, I have a couple of points. Before I know there's a couple of other comments coming in here as well. But what strikes me with all this is that this is really the last generation that's not computerized. So it's really important that we get this information down.
Yes, yes. There's a simple answer to that one, but yes, because the written information is very, very slight. Understandably, activist groups are not always the best at keeping minutes, unless they have an obsessive minute taker sometimes. But the things like the gay theatre group, you know, getting Jimmy's thoughts on that on record is going to be essential. You know, the Irish Gays in London group, which existed right at the beginning of the 80s, that would be really important to try and pick through. But I think a lot of the figures have moved. But I think Glenn is still around, so he would be an interesting person to talk to about that. And there are other groups that follow on as well, which would be really important to pick through. But if in 20 years' time we haven't done this work now, all we're going to be left with is the little bit of paperwork that's there, and we won't be able to do much with it because all of the folks that we can now talk to will have passed on or may not remember or whatever it might be. If we don't do it now, we're out of time.
The other thing is, before we go on to this, I was actually telling a friend of mine that I was going to, you know, that we were doing this weekend or this week, and it struck a chord with her because she told me about a neighbour. I don't even know what part of Ireland she's from. And her mum, she was telling her mum, and she, you know, the whole story and how family stories go. But it was a neighbour had met her mum on the street in the 80s. And the mum asked the neighbour, then the neighbour looked awful, didn't look well at all, and her mum asked the neighbour what was wrong. She looked not in good shape at all. And now we don't know what it was. We're presuming that it was HIV or AIDS, but the neighbour told my friend's mum that her son had arrived home from London, told her that he was extremely ill and that he'd never be home again, and had just left, said goodbye to everybody and left, and that was it. And I think the way that my friend just retold the story, it was just so shocking that you know that you can't or you couldn't or didn't think you could have your family's support around you because there was no treatment, and that it was still a case of what the neighbours are going to think. It's just absolutely horrifying to us now. Couple of comments. Bernard says, I worked at London Lighthouse with many Irish who were HIV and AIDS. We could never go public about this. When people died to their Irish families, we were forced to say that they died of cancer or heart failure. How much has this changed? We also have Ian, Dr. Morris Casey, who's a good friend of ours. Morris has spoken to the group before on the history of the Irish LGBT movement. I think he wants to organise a conference in June, July or Dublin. I know that he's in the middle of organising an exhibition in the Epic Museum in Dublin. Just for the record, Colm, Jim Ennis and Michael O'Dwyer all died of AIDS in the 1980s and were heavily involved with the Brixton gay community in Scots. We lost some of the most radical and creative people. Francis Carter, I researched the Irish diaspora in Dubai, plus I lived in Brixton. Wow. John says, Colm landed in the UK in 1973, immediately became involved with LGBT rights. John was involved in getting his plays over here in London. He also knew 3 other people, friend of Mark Ashton's. I knew him as General Secretary of the Young Communist League and Executive Communist Party. I was also involved in, he was a leading light in the campaign around HIV, and his death changed attitudes on safer sex forever. Mihal, I lived in London from 1988 to 2008 and joined the Irish Gay Network based in the LLGC in Farringdon Street, which out of which the Irish Gay Helpline 1990-1999 was founded. The Irish Gay Network were also supportive of the campaign for decriminalisation in Ireland. That's one thing that we haven't mentioned. It was still totally illegal at home in Ireland. In particular through their support of the Glen campaign. PIAA, now just mentioned, and Immokaleen also came to mind. The Gay Céilís at the London Irish Centre, Camden, organised by Immokaleen, were important for immigrant LGBTQ cohesion, and is all of this well documented? There are sources of historical data within the community. Well, this is the issue. I think now it's really important that when this is all in our public sphere and in our minds, that we try and get this into like one space or something like that. How do we do that? Jane Wells, I'm working to make that documentary. My uncle passed from AIDS-related illness in 1986 alone in London, likely one of the men in hospital beds. You spoke of Joseph. This part of the story is very unsettling, and is the loneliness of his death. I understand that his body wouldn't be brought home, and the family wouldn't visit. I wonder if you could speak to that. So James says, so fascinating to hear this. I had no idea of the significance of the Irish LGBTQ plus community in London at that time. Is there any thought, Barry says, is there any thought on racism, profiling and other exclusion from BAME definition? I came in 1993 and was continually stopped at Heathrow and was horrified to read about Pontins. I can still feel very invisible to be Irish, not part of the white British or BAME. That's a good point, actually. Grania, there are some books researchers who do cover the 80s, 90s from an Irish queer diaspora point of view. I recommend Dr. Cormac O'Brien at UCD. He does some mega cool stuff. Joanne, dead right, Ian, we lost some really important voices. I'm a psychology student, JH, who emigrated to London in the 80s. I worked as a buddy back then. I want to do a qualitative study as a PhD, interviewing people who lived through this era, I should say. I guess if people want to get in touch with JH there, he'd be delighted if people were here. I accidentally have a painting done by Jim Ennis. I want to know more about the story about the accidentally. I wonder if his family or some archive exhibition might like to have it. I'm sure they would. Grania, I've heard there was a lot of support for Irish LGBTQ people living from HIV from the same networks in London. Yeah, who were helping Irish women to gain access to abortion at the time? Yeah, it's there are. Again, you were talking about the echoes earlier on, and there seems to be echoes all the time. It's like history repeating itself.
Yeah, I think so.
Can I just come back on one or two things there, Vanessa? Yeah. So Bernard asked about, I think in the London Lighthouse, and families saying that their sons had died of cancer and so on. I mean, that was very, very typical. I mean, if you look at the number of people who died, there were probably, a large percentage would have been described as, or would have been the locals in Ireland would have been told that the nephew or the son or whatever in London had died from cancer or something like that. Now, there was an interesting, as a result of It's a Sin, there's been a whole series, it's gone to HBO now in America. And there's been a series of discussions with Russell T Davies and the cast. And I watched one of them the other night. And Russell T Davies said something very interesting. He said that one of the families of these cases where the parents had actually said the son had died of cancer, they wouldn't discuss it, but they've both passed away. And the brother contacted Russell T Davies and said, you know, now that my parents are gone, I'm prepared to be completely out that my brother died of AIDS, and I'm, you know, prepared to state that publicly and all the rest. And so Russell T Davies was speculating to what extent will that change when the parents, you know, that generation who were the parents have passed on. So I think, you know, that may be just a question of time. But of course, you know, in terms of records and so on, it's always going to be very difficult, I think, to prove who did actually die. And I think Jane's question about her uncle, you know, dying in the hospital bed, I agree with her completely. I mean, I said this earlier, there's a need for a documentary to be made about what happened with the Irish at the time coming over to London and so on. And many of those were disowned by their families and were, you know, died here with no support, very, very lonely deaths. And I think that the whole story really, and what the attitude of the church was as well, you know, which we haven't discussed that much, but, you know, I think all of that needs to be recorded, I think. And we did organize a conference in 2018 with the Irish in Britain, which was about the LGBT immigrant experience. And that's where we had some of those reports, you know, from people.
Tanya says there were some great organizations where Irish lesbians and gay men worked together with others, the Red Admiral Project, Body Positive, the Lighthouse, Terence Higgins. What I guess is that it's always difficult to speak about the cumulative grief we all experienced during this work. And I think, again, history repeating, but I think when one of the things that watching It's a Sin in the middle of a pandemic was like, they were locked away. These guys were locked away in rooms on their own. They weren't allowed to talk to people. They weren't like getting your dinner pushed in through the door. That's inhumane.
Yeah, and it's a global story as well. It happened everywhere. It was sort of like, you know, almost like you were radioactive, and they didn't want to go anywhere near for the fear of getting that transmission from that individual, and that just meant that those last few months were very, very lonely, especially if you couldn't face up to that double coming out, which is that you come out to your community here in London, but perhaps had left yourself more ambiguous at home, or still in closets at home, and then had to go through that whole process again whilst you're really not very well at all. And I think that's the psychology of that. We were just talking about psychology students there. The psychology of those experiences is almost impossible for us to appreciate now, and put ourselves back into those moments in the 80s and early 90s. But that's what went on. That was so common that it was easier to say, oh, I've been really unlucky and I've got leukemia or cancer or something like that, as a way of not having to face up sometimes, I think, to that double coming out, which is an enormous pressure to face when you're really not very well at all.
Kelly just made a note there and linked to Breaking Ground film. I actually have that film on order. Really want to see it, about the London Irish Women's Centre. And yeah, with COVID we have PPE. With AIDS it was barrier nursing. There's someone else there, I think it was it Eamon Summers? He said that he helped set up the Irish Gay Network and the Irish Gay Helpline. And then Jim mentions that he was a prime mover in setting it up and that they wouldn't have existed without him. So fair play, Eamon. You would be an interesting chap to get on a panel sometime. Yeah, I mean, there's a lot of there's a lot of stories. A lot of people still are very emotional, and quite rightly, about this time as well. But when you're talking about history and you're talking about people's emotions and the stories, you mentioned about history, and I've always heard that there's three truths, as in my truth, your truth, and what actually happened.
Yeah, and that's the thing that the oral historian has to get through, is that if you're turning up to an interview, you want to get something out of someone, but they want to tell you a story, and it may not actually marry up with the reality of that particular moment, because what you've read doesn't tally, what they remember doesn't tally, and so forth. But it's somewhere in the middle of all of that is that central truth, which is, this is what happened in the past, and this is what it was really like. But it's very difficult to convey that in writing, unless you've got the supreme novelist's skill. But the oral testimony, that hearing someone's voice, hearing those quivers as they tell you the stories of what it was like, for the emotions building up, that's the powerful testimony that we're missing from the archive at present.
Joseph, are you going to say something there?
Yeah, I was just going to say, I mean, I always like to use my Riverdance quote. And that is that, the reception of the Irish in Britain, there's the pre-Riverdance and the post-Riverdance period. And pre-Riverdance, we were not flavor of the month. We were either terrorists or, Victorian caricatures, like from Punch magazine and so on, figures of, suspicion and alienation. And then, post-Riverdance and the Celtic Tiger, we were suddenly flavor of the month, Irish pubs on every corner and so on. So we have to remember that the Irish experience of coming here and living here was very, very different in those periods. I mean, now to be Irish in London or in the UK, especially when it's the Muslim community and so on in particular, who are now getting the sort of thing that we were getting back in the 80s. I mean, I remember being almost arrested boarding the ferry at Liverpool because some papers weren't in order, whether I was going to be held under the Prevention of Terrorism Act. You have that constant threat as well in the background. So, being Irish and gay in Britain at the time was not easy.
We're quickly running out of time here this evening. Now, I know that we would love to have you come and speak with us again, Daryl, if you were up for that. If anyone has any last minute questions, get them in now, because I want to ask Daryl about his book. So you've written this paper, and you're currently writing an Irish LGBT diaspora history. Where do you start with that? Where do you end? How big and how heavy is it going to be?
Well, I take it as the start, opening a door. So I've cheated and I've called it a brief history, because even if you had War and Peace, even if you had every volume of Proust or something like that, you still wouldn't get everything in. I mean, just looking at the chat, and I've lost track of it. It's been running like the clappers, because there are so many memories, and every single individual has a memory, and the LGBTQ plus Irish diaspora is unknowably sizable. If you think, I was reading a couple of months ago, in the middle of lockdown, as one does, the petty sessions records and the crime records for Ireland in the 19th century. And you look at them, and these are folks who are sent to prison. They might be 20, 25 for one particular offence. And the first thing they do as soon as they're on parole is go straight to the boat. And they're out from Cove, they're out from Dunleary or wherever it might be, straight to America, straight to Britain, straight to Australia, wherever they happen to want to go to start a new life. And therefore we don't have an exact quantifiable number of individuals who've ever left the island who are somewhere in the rainbow community, as Tony Walsh was calling it the other day, which was a brilliant notion of his. So you can start wherever you want to, but I always feel it's important to start with the people who are like us. And not the bigwigs, not the fancy people who live, end up in their fancy schmancy houses because they can move from one place to another very easily. I think it's important to start with the people who have nothing when they leave, have nothing when they arrive, and have to make something of that experience, because that is the true, real experience of everybody. And that is very, very, very difficult to unpick, but not impossible. The records are there. It's just that it doesn't have a big rainbow on the record and says this person is easy to identify. You have to make measured guesses. There's a comment just flashed up there, how large the trans community was. Who knows? That's very, very difficult to guess. We can't even tell you how big the gay men's community was, and they are the easiest to find in the records. Every other part of the spectrum becomes increasingly harder. So ultimately, it's as large as the Irish diaspora itself, and that's unknowably large in its own terms, isn't it? So, but start at the beginning with the people that are most like us, and that's really where we want to start the story.
Someone's saying this needs a conference. Ooh, don't be giving me work. But yeah, it probably does. There's lots of calls there for emails and how people can get in touch with both of you. I suppose your Twitter handles are probably a good place that's public and available that people can find you on. Daryl, where can we get you on Twitter?
I am Dr Leeworthy, which is, I would type it out, but I'm on a little iPad and it's not very easily.
Okay.
And then my surname, which you might be able to see on the little screen underneath.
So Doc Leeworthy, isn't it?
Yes.
Like that?
That's exactly how it is, yeah.
And Joseph, can I give yours?
I'll just put mine in the chat, yeah.
I think that's it. If not, someone else is getting all Joseph's messages. Yeah, there we go. Listen, thank you to everybody who has come along this evening. Again, thanks to Ambassador Adrian O'Neill. Thanks to Izzy and to Rachel and all the events team in the embassy for helping us with tonight. It's very much appreciated, and it's very much appreciated. And it means a lot to the LGBTQ community that the embassy have given us this platform. We could do this maybe on another platform or somewhere else, but the fact that the embassy has come on board for a talk like this it warms our little hearts, to be quite honest with you. It's very, very much appreciated. Again, if anybody would like to get in touch with us, join our mailing list, get invites to future events, LondonIrishLGBT.wordpress.com. You can sign up to our mailing list there. Loads of people, you're all very welcome. Thank you so much for coming along. Joseph, Daryl, thank you. Hopefully we shall have another chat at some stage and take this discussion further, and maybe do you know what, going on what you guys have said, this is a good overview, but I think we could nearly break it down into different sections and talk in depth about different things. So I think that might be a really good thing to look at for the future. But for everybody who joined us today, and if this is the first time that you've come to an event with the LGBT network here in London, thanks so much. And again, thanks to the embassy, and have a good night.
Bye, everyone.
Bye, everyone.
Bye.